What would you do if the land your family built with their own hands, the land you poured your sweat and soul into, was suddenly under attack, not by nature, not by bad luck, but by the very people who called themselves your neighbors? For Ethan Caldwell, his farm wasn't just land. It was history. It was his father's backbreaking labor, his grandfather's dream, and the legacy he swore to protect. Tucked just outside the limits of a growing suburban town, it had been in his family for generations, standing firm through droughts, storms, and the steady creep of development. But lately, the biggest threat wasn't a failing crop or a tough winter, it was the people who thought they had the right to take it from him. Ethan had never cared much for the homeowners association that governed the cookie-cutter houses down the road. They had their rules, their regulations, and their constant complaints, but his farm wasn't part of their jurisdiction. Or at least, that's what he had always believed. Karen Whitmore, the iron-fisted president of the HOA, seemed to think otherwise. It started with the letters. Stiffly worded notices claiming his fences were an eyesore and his security cameras made the neighborhood feel unsafe. He ignored them. Then came the fines, ridiculous fees citing obscure zoning regulations, all mailed from an HOA he wasn't even a member of. When he confronted Karen, she smiled that plastic, insincere smile and simply said, "Rules are rules, Ethan. If your farm is going to exist in our community, it needs to be a welcoming presence." That was the first real warning sign. The second came when small things started going wrong. A fence mysteriously broken, irrigation hoses slashed in the night, tire tracks cutting deep into his crops. At first, Ethan thought it was bad luck. Then it happened again. And again. And when he installed cameras to catch whoever was doing it, he woke up one morning to find his warning signs torn down and his front gate hanging open. It didn't take long for him to figure out that this wasn't just vandalism. This was deliberate. Someone wanted him gone. Someone wanted to push him off his own land. And if Ethan didn't fight back, they might just win. Ethan hadn't realized just how deep the rot ran until the town started turning against him. At first, it was subtle. Neighbors who used to wave when they passed by now looked the other way. Orders from local suppliers started getting delayed, then outright cancelled, always with some flimsy excuse about inventory or policy changes. When he went into town for supplies, he caught snippets of hushed conversations, his name whispered alongside words like reckless and dangerous. It didn't take a genius to figure out where it was coming from. Karen Whitmore. She wasn't just running the HOA, she was controlling the entire conversation. The accusations she had once made in private letters were now being spread like gospel in town meetings, at grocery stores, and over backyard fences. It wasn't enough for her to harass Ethan with fines, she wanted to poison the well, to make him the town's villain before he even had a chance to fight back. The final proof came when Dale Thompson, a neighboring farmer, called him one afternoon, his voice hesitant. "Ethan, listen. I don't know what's going on, but people are saying you've got bear traps all over your property. They're saying a kid or a dog's gonna get caught in one." Ethan nearly crushed the phone in his hand. "You know that's not true, Dale. I put up clear signs. Those traps are meant for coyotes, and they're nowhere near public access." Dale sighed. "I know. But Karen's been telling people otherwise. Says she's been warning you to take them down and that you're refusing. People believe her, Ethan. You need to get ahead of this." Ahead of it? How? He didn't have Karen's connections, her polished speeches, or her influence over the town. All he had was his truth, and right now, that wasn't enough. The next morning, he woke to find his property vandalized, again. His irrigation system had been slashed wide open, flooding a section of his field, the soft earth churned up with deep footprints. He followed the tracks toward the far edge of his land, past the broken fence, until he spotted something snagged on a low-hanging branch. A scrap of dark denim, torn at the edge. Ethan's mind snapped back to the last time he'd seen Travis Harlow, limping near the property line, a makeshift bandage wrapped around his leg. His stomach twisted. He took the fabric straight to Deputy Hank Whitaker, demanding an investigation. Whitaker listened, took down the details, but his face was as unreadable as ever. "It's something, Ethan, but it's not enough. This doesn't prove who was there or what they did. I'll keep it on record, but we need more than a torn piece of cloth." Frustration burned in Ethan's chest. Karen and Travis were smart. They weren't stupid enough to leave behind direct evidence, and they knew exactly how to work around the law. If he confronted Travis outright, the man would just laugh in his face. If he tried to take on Karen publicly, she'd spin it as another sign of his unstable behavior. He was trapped, watching his land get chipped away, while the people responsible smiled and pretended their hands were clean. Then, Karen made her next move. A town meeting was called, officially about community safety, but, as Ethan suspected, it quickly turned into a public tribunal against him. Karen stood at the front, flanked by HOA members, speaking in that perfectly practiced, condescending tone of hers. "We all want to live in a peaceful, welcoming neighborhood, don't we?" she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "But lately, there have been concerns." She paused for dramatic effect, eyes sweeping across the gathered crowd. Concerns about property hazards. Concerns about reckless landowners who refuse to respect community values. She didn't say his name, but she didn't have to. The murmurs started immediately. A woman raised her hand. "I heard his farm is booby-trapped. My nephew plays near those fields, what if something happens?" Karen sighed, shaking her head with feigned sympathy. "That's exactly why we need to act now before it's too late." Ethan had heard enough. He pushed to his feet, anger tightening his jaw. "You're lying, Karen." Gasps rippled through the room. Karen barely blinked, her expression unreadable. "Ethan, I understand you're upset, but these are real concerns from real residents. You can't just ignore the voices of the community." "The community doesn't get a say in what happens on my land," Ethan shot back. "I'm not part of your HOA, and I don't answer to you." Karen smiled. That smug, knowing smile. "Well, Ethan, that might not be entirely true. After all, if your property affects the community, then it becomes a community concern. And we do have ways of ensuring compliance." The words sent a chill down Ethan's spine. That wasn't a threat, it was a promise. She wasn't just trying to ruin his reputation anymore. She was gearing up to take his land. Ethan had always believed that hard work and resilience could solve most problems. But this was something else entirely. Karen wasn't just trying to ruin his reputation, she was coming for his farm, piece by piece, inch by inch, using every loophole, every dirty trick, and every ounce of influence she had. And the worst part? It was working. The morning after the town meeting, Ethan found a formal letter taped to his front gate. The HOA was proposing a community land reassessment, claiming that part of his property, land that had been in his family for generations, was underutilized and could be repurposed for a community park. The language was all legalese and bureaucracy, but the message was clear: they wanted to take his land. He stormed into town, the letter clenched in his fist, and walked straight into Rebecca Langston's law office. His lawyer barely had time to look up before he slammed the document onto her desk. "Tell me this is a joke." Rebecca's eyes scanned the letter, her expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief to outright anger. "They're out of their minds," she muttered, flipping through the pages. "You're outside the HOA's jurisdiction. They don't have the authority to seize your land. But they're trying to use a zoning loophole to force you into compliance." Ethan gritted his teeth. "Can they do that?" Rebecca exhaled sharply. "They can try. If they get enough signatures and argue that your farm is affecting community interests, they can push this to the county board. If it passes, they could force an eminent domain case. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. So what do we do? Rebecca leaned forward. We block them before they get that far. I'll file a legal challenge, but you need to be prepared. Karen's not going to back down, and she's going to fight dirty. That much was obvious. Because while Rebecca worked the legal angles, Ethan's farm was still under attack. That night, he heard his dog, Scout, barking furiously near the barn. He grabbed his flashlight and shotgun, moving quickly through the darkness. As he neared the edge of his property, the beam of his flashlight caught movement, 2 figures, dressed in dark clothing, crouching near his irrigation system. His stomach twisted. This wasn't random vandalism anymore. This was calculated sabotage. Hey! Ethan's voice rang through the night. Get the hell off my land. The figures bolted. He raced after them, but they knew the terrain well, darting through the tree line before he could close the distance. When he reached the spot where they had been working, his flashlight illuminated freshly cut irrigation pipes, water gushing into the dirt, and next to them, half buried in the mud, a discarded beer can, the same brand Travis always drank. Fury coursed through him. This was Travis. This was deliberate. The next morning, Ethan took the evidence straight to Deputy Whitaker. This is the 3rd time my property's been hit, he growled, placing the beer can on the desk. You need to do something. Whitaker picked it up, examining it with a frown. It's circumstantial. Ethan clenched his jaw. You know it's him. I suspect it's him, Whitaker corrected, leaning back in his chair. But a beer can isn't proof. I need something stronger, Ethan. A witness. Footage. A confession. Something we can take to court. Ethan exhaled, his fists tightening. So what? I just sit back and wait until he destroys everything I have? Whitaker's face hardened. No. You document everything. You keep your cameras rolling, and you let us handle this legally. I know it's frustrating, but if you go after Travis yourself, you'll be the one in trouble. Ethan knew he was right. But knowing it didn't make it any easier. 2 days later, things escalated again. This time, it wasn't just sabotage, it was arson. It was past midnight when Ethan woke to the acrid smell of smoke. His heart slammed against his ribs as he bolted upright, his mind already racing before his feet hit the floor. Fire. He grabbed his shotgun and rushed outside, the glow of flames illuminating the sky. His barn, his livelihood, was burning. The fire was fast, hungry, merciless. He grabbed the nearest hose, but the flames had already swallowed half the structure. By the time the fire department arrived, it was too late. His equipment, his feed, everything he had built, it was gone. As the fire smoldered, Travis was nowhere to be seen. But Karen? She showed up the next morning, standing at the edge of his driveway with a sympathetic smile that made Ethan want to tear his own teeth out. This is just awful, she sighed, shaking her head. A real tragedy. Ethan's fingers curled into fists. Don't. Karen ignored him. You know, Ethan, this farm has been such a point of contention lately. Maybe it's time to consider a fresh start. If you'd be willing to sell, I'm sure the HOA could help arrange something fair. Ethan took a step toward her, his voice low and dangerous. Get off my land. Karen didn't flinch. Instead, she let out a soft, amused chuckle. Suit yourself. But, be careful, Ethan. This kind of stress isn't good for you. She left without another word, but her meaning was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Ethan stood in the smoldering remains of his barn, the morning light filtering through the skeletal beams that once held up the roof. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burnt wood and melted metal, the charred ground beneath his boots still radiating heat. It wasn't just a fire. It was a message. His mind replayed the previous night in sharp, agonizing detail, the sudden jolt awake, the flicker of orange through his window, the way his gut had twisted with the horrible realization that he was too late. He had fought the flames, his hands raw from the heat, his throat thick with smoke, but none of it had mattered. Everything inside, his tools, his supplies, his stored feed for the coming season, was gone. And then Karen had appeared. That smug, well-practiced concern on her face. The subtle yet deliberate way she had suggested he sell before things got worse. She hadn't started the fire herself, but she hadn't needed to. She had orchestrated everything up to this moment. But Ethan wasn't going to break. Not now. By mid-morning, Deputy Whitaker arrived, his expression unreadable as he stepped over the blackened debris. "Ethan," he greeted, voice heavy. "I need to ask, do you have any reason to believe this wasn't an accident?" Ethan's fists clenched. "You already know the answer to that." Whitaker sighed, nodding toward the wreckage. "We're treating this as arson, but I need something solid. If Travis or anyone else was involved, I need proof." Ethan exhaled sharply. Proof. That's what this all came down to. Not the weeks of sabotage, not the threats, not even the beer can or the slashed irrigation hoses. They wanted something irrefutable. So Ethan gave it to them. That night, he combed through his property with fresh eyes. The fire had been set deliberately, he was sure of it. If someone had been careless, there would have been a trail, evidence of a mistake. But this? This had been planned. Near the remains of the barn, half buried in the dirt, he spotted something. A small, charred scrap of fabric. He picked it up, heart pounding. It was dark blue, the edges melted from the heat. But underneath the damage, the faint outline of a work glove brand he had seen before. Travis. Ethan didn't waste time. He drove straight to Whitaker's office, dropping the evidence on the deputy's desk. "Test it," he said, voice edged with steel. Whitaker studied the fabric before nodding. "I'll see what I can do." The next morning, things escalated even further. Rebecca called, her voice urgent. "Ethan, I just got word from the sheriff's office. They subpoenaed Travis's phone records." Ethan's pulse spiked. "And?" There was a pause, then Rebecca spoke, her words slow and deliberate. "There are messages. Between him and an unknown number. And they're bad, Ethan." She forwarded the files, and as Ethan opened them, his stomach twisted. "The barn will send a message. He'll give up after that." The words sat on the screen, damning in their simplicity. Ethan barely heard Rebecca's voice as she continued, "The sheriff's office is working on identifying the second number. But this is enough to push for a warrant to search Travis's property." And just like that, the game had changed. By the following evening, deputies descended on Travis's house. Ethan wasn't allowed near the scene, but he watched from the road as officers searched the shed out back. It wasn't long before they found what they needed. Gasoline cans. Tools that matched the damage done to Ethan's farm. Even crude, hand-drawn maps of Ethan's property with security weak points marked. And then the biggest revelation of all, a handwritten note with Karen's initials. Ethan's grip tightened around the steering wheel as he watched Travis being hauled toward a police car, shouting about how he was being set up. But the evidence was there, and this time, it was enough. And Karen? She was nowhere to be seen. But Ethan knew, this wasn't over yet. The day Travis was arrested should have been the end of it. The evidence was overwhelming, his own phone records, the gasoline cans, the maps of Ethan's property, the note with Karen's initials. It was everything the sheriff's office needed to move forward with charges of arson, vandalism, and criminal conspiracy. But Ethan knew better than to celebrate too soon. Because Karen hadn't made a single move. For someone who had pulled the strings on this whole mess, she was too quiet. Too careful. And when the sheriff's office subpoenaed more records, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Karen hadn't just enabled Travis, she had funded him. Bank statements traced large cash withdrawals from Karen's personal accounts, all made in the weeks leading up to the fire. The same amount that had been deposited into Travis's account shortly before the barn burned down. It wasn't just complicity. It was direct financial involvement in a crime. When deputies showed up at her doorstep with a warrant, she still tried to talk her way out of it, claiming it was a misunderstanding and that she was being targeted unfairly. But this time, there was no HOA power to hide behind. No legal loopholes. Karen Whitmore was arrested, charged with conspiracy to commit arson, fraud, and falsifying reports. With both of them facing trial, Ethan finally felt the weight start to lift. He sued them both for damages, and won. Between court-ordered restitution and insurance payouts, he had enough to rebuild the barn, fortify his farm, and ensure nothing like this could ever happen again. But even after the dust settled, the scars remained, not just in the land, but in the way the town looked at him. Some people still believed Karen's lies. Some still refused to admit they'd been manipulated. So Ethan did what he did best. He worked. He rebuilt. And when his new barn was completed, he hosted an open house for the entire community, inviting every neighbor, even the ones who had turned against him. Slowly, the tension eased. Slowly, people saw the truth for themselves. And as he stood on his porch that night, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he let out a long breath. Karen and Travis had nearly taken everything from him. But nearly wasn't enough. They were gone. His land was still his. And no one would ever take it from him again. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.